Hi there, I hope you're all keeping safe. In today's video I'm going to take us through my thought process recently around what memory cards should I use with my Nikon Z8 camera. I'm also going to do some simple testing with those cards to see whether the reality lived up to my thinking. I'm going to predominantly focus on stills photography because there's some great videos already out there from Richie and Matt Irwin around video capabilities in different cards. They're great videos and worth a watch as well. In the modern digital era, you have to think increasingly about the end-to-end workflow. One of the bigger decisions you have to make when you're upgrading your camera is around memory cards. So lots of different dimensions that you've got to think about. So as I mentioned, we have to think about the end-to-end flow of images or data from the sensor to the card. Now, to me, this can be likened to water cascading through two buckets. So when thinking about cards, we have to think about balancing the system to allow the data to flow smoothly through the system. So memory cards are obviously critical, but not all card formats are equal and not all cards of the same format are equal. And increasingly with the different types of formats of cards, it's a complex space. And in looking at these considerations, it's really important we think about how we use our cameras. Now for me, I use my Z series cameras in a hybrid role. I shoot stills and I shoot video with them. Now, with the Z8 and its increased capability, I'm considering whether actually that's going to change slightly. So I started off by thinking about what existing cards might I be able to use with the Z8. Now obviously the Z8 has two card slots. XQD cards have been my staple memory card for about 6 years now. When I had my D850 I bought a Lexar XQD card, and then when I upgraded to a Z6 and a Z7, I was lucky it came as a bundle and each of them came with a Sony G XQD card. Now let's start getting into the write speeds. On the XQD cards, both the Lexar and the Sony have write speed is 400 megabytes per second. When I looked at my SD cards, I found I have a SanDisk Extreme Pro 128 gigabyte card, and I bought a Lexar 2000 times 64 gigabyte card. So I had a small collection of different types of memory cards, and at that point the only real advice from Nikon was in the manual. There's a page down at page 920 in the manual about approved memory cards, and they highlight the need to have high performing cards. So their recommendation is cards with at least a 250 megabytes per second write speed, and they highlight the Nikon 660 gigabyte CF Express Type B card and the ProGrade Digital Cobalt series CF Express Type B cards. So those are some of the component parts, pieces of the jigsaw that we have to start thinking about. But as I said, we have to think about the end-to-end workflow, the data flows, and we have to think at a systems level. So it's important to think, or to start thinking about the data flowing into that buffer bucket. How are we going to use the camera? What's our use case? What are the boundary conditions, i.e. the conditions at which are going to really stress the system? What's that biggest data flow that we are realistically likely to use? Now, for me, stills was a good starting place. About 10% of the time I shoot higher frames per second. I tend to shoot in lossless RAW. So with the Z8, you have the capability of shooting up to 20 frames per second in lossless RAW. A lossless RAW file is about 51.6 megabytes. And what it gives you is 1032 megabytes per second is probably the highest flow of data into that buffer bucket. If we think about video, then probably the boundary condition there is NRAW high quality 8K 12-bit at 60 frames per second. So as you can see, video is not necessarily the highest boundary condition. Either way, in either of those use cases, stills or video, we are talking significant amounts of data flow. So let's start to unpack the different use cases and see what the kind of bandwidths we're going to be thinking about or needing for data. So on this chart, I've built out some different frames per second, 20, 10 or 5 frames per second, and across the horizontal axis are different formats that you can choose. Equally below that, we've got the C30, which is 30 frames per second, C60, which is 60 frames per second, and then C120. You'll see from each of these that actually Nikon restrict the file format for each of these C shooting conditions. And it starts to become obvious why when you lay out the bandwidth requirements. What you can see is there is some quite considerable bandwidth requirements, quite often more than many memory cards can cope with. If we also do the same for video, there are other frame rates that you can use, but these give you an indication of the highest, the lower, and somewhere in the middle. And again, you can see there are big differences between RAW and H.265, particularly when you start to look at the difference between 4K and 8K. Obviously, the H.265 and 264 are doing in-camera processing, which really compresses the video and brings it down to a codec where the difference between 4K and 8K is a lot lower than when it's a RAW format. Now, both of these tables of unpacking the different bandwidths do assume that you've got a balanced system performance, i.e. data is flowing smoothly and there are no bottlenecks. So we're still quite theoretical. We haven't brought in a real-world overlay. As I said at the beginning of the video, I'm going to focus in on stills today. However, from the previous tables, as you could see, card performance is critical to avoid that buffer from filling up. And therefore, moving to a CF Express Type B card was likely to be needed for what I was looking for. So as I said earlier, not all cards are equal, or all of the same format of cards are equal. And when you look at different manufacturers of CF Express Type B cards, what you usually find is that each manufacturer has 2 ranges. So it's easy to think that they're okay and more than enough performance there for what we had in the tables. But often performance, particularly of those good cards, is card size dependent. And what we're looking at there with those speeds, both in the good and the high performance, are laboratory performance. And the real world is quite often slightly different. So I started to narrow down onto those high performing ranges from each of the manufacturers. I ended up going for the 165GB ProGrade Cobalt because the ProGrade Cobalt was one of the recommended cards in the Nikon Z8 manual. When I looked at a 165GB card, that would allow me to store 1800 lossless RAW images. I did look at the Delkin black range of cards, but at the time I was buying, the ProGrade Cobalt was about $1.46 per gigabyte, whereas the Delkin was $1.73 per gigabyte, so a 20% premium. At this time, I hadn't found my Lexar SD card, so I also invested in a Kingston Canvas React Plus 128GB SDXC card. Now that's a pretty good value option as an overflow card because it's down at $0.76 per gigabyte, so about half the price of a CF Express card. And with that 128GB card, it would allow me to have an overflow of an additional 1400 lossless RAW images. So were my buying decisions good ones? Was the ProGrade Cobalt CF Express and the Kingston SD card good cards to choose? The only way to find out is to do a real-world test. So as I said, I'm going to focus on stills performance, and I'm going to base the test and focus that test on the boundary case that I talked about, because that's probably the highest bandwidth that we're going to need. Now in theory, the ProGrade Cobalt has a minimum sustained write speed of 1400 megabits per second, and therefore it should be more than enough to empty that buffer quicker than it's filling up. So I set up a simple non-scientific test, and what I did was I shot for 15 seconds. And at the end of the 15 seconds, I could do a number of measures. So let's watch an overlay of how the cards performed. So here we have the cards ranked from the theoretically slowest at the bottom to the theoretically fastest at the top. You'll notice the R numbers on the right hand side, the remaining images for the buffer are slightly different. That's because I was using my Ninja 5 to record the LCD and I had to start it manually, and there was a split-second difference sometimes, but I can assure you it comes out in the rounding in the results. So let's take a look at the 15 seconds of high burst shooting. So let's pause here. At about 3 seconds we can see that all of the cards except for the ProGrade CF Express have filled the buffer, and I could hear the shutter sound being intermittent to indicate that there was some throttling of the shutter release. And from this point on it's pretty static right through to the end of the 15 seconds. So let's take a look at the results, and I've ranked them from the slowest card at the top to the fastest card at the bottom this time. And I've captured the various data I said, and I've calculated the actual rough write performance and compared that to the specification performance. And it was broadly quite positive. The Lexar and the Kingston SD cards were outperforming their specification in terms of write speed. The XQD cards were on a par with their specification write speed. There was one anomaly, and that was with the CF Express card at the bottom. You remember it showed that it got to 16 images remaining in the buffer and sat at that. Now if that was happening, I would have expected this to capture 300 images. However, there were only 244 in the folder, and the folder size was that which you'd expect for 244. So as I say, an anomaly, and one worthy of further investigation. So I reran the test a couple more times, and the results were the same. So I reached for the manual, all 947 pages of it, and on page 134 you'll find notes on frame advance rate. Now what it says there is that the figures that it gives assume AFC and manual mode and 1/250th of a second or faster shutter speed. It also notes that the frames per second may slow down if you're shooting with flash. Now I wasn't doing that. If you're shooting in silent mode, and I wasn't doing that. If you have flicker detect on, it may also slow down the frame rate, and I didn't have that turned on. Equally, if your aperture is stopped down, then it could affect the frame rate. However, I was shooting at f2.8. So I reran the tests in manual mode, just to discount that, and at 1/250th of a second shutter speed. And here's the result. So we've got the 15 seconds from the original test at the bottom, done at 1/200th of a second. We've got some new test footage at the top, done at 1/250th of a second. So let's look at how they compare. So we can see that the buffer number is changing in a different way. When it's 1/250th of a second, it drops down to 0 over about 3 seconds, and then every so often there's one image remaining. So this indicated that the data flow, the buffer and the card performed consistently and predictably. However, there was something about how the camera was communicating via the shutter sound and the data on the LCD screen. So I went back to the manual, back to page 134, and further down the page there is a section called Cautions on Burst Photography. And here there's a series of bullets about the memory card light and making sure you don't turn the camera off before all of the images have been written to the memory card. And in the middle of this there is a bullet that's relevant here, and it says, at shutter speeds slower than 1/250th of a second, the shooting display does not update in real time during burst photography. To track your subject during shooting, choose shutter speeds faster than 1/250th of a second. Now when I was shooting, because of the nature of the test that I'd set up, it was a static image. So I actually didn't see that perhaps the whole image display wasn't updating. The shutter sound was going as if the shutter was going in a normal continuous manner, and the buffer indicator, you'll remember, showed 16 shots remaining to fill the buffer. So nothing indicated that there was any restriction or bottleneck in the system. So I think what we were seeing is below 1/250th of a second shutter speed, the shooting display, including the data, doesn't update in real time. The information about the buffer sticks. In our case, it showed 16 remaining images to fill the buffer. And it's important to remember the shutter sound in the Z8 is a synthetic shutter sound. And it also sticks, which makes it sound like it's continuously firing. There's no buffering going on. So I went back and reran the tests on all the other cards at 1/250th of a second, and the results are on the screen. As you'll see, they're pretty similar within a margin of error for all of the cards. Interestingly, the CF Express is the card that really seems to underperform compared to its specification, interestingly. Now, finding this isn't a criticism of the Z8. It's in the manual, even if it is slightly oblique wording hidden in the middle of a series of bullets on the memory card writing light. But it is important to know, and that's why I've included it in this video. It's important to know for real world shooting. So if you're shooting at 20 frames per second, slower than a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second, you're not going to see accurate information on the LCD or in the EVF. Your subject isn't going to be necessarily updating. Now, interestingly, I only saw this happening with the CF Express card, a high performance card. All of the other cards, probably because they were buffering, gave the camera breathing space to process the data that it was feeding to me, to change the shutter sound to an intermittent one to indicate that there was buffering going on. Now, it's equally important to put this in a real world context, and that's why I don't think it's an issue with the Z8 particularly, because if I'm shooting higher frames per second, then I'm going to be typically shooting in shutter priority, and I'm likely to be setting the shutter speed at much faster than 1/250th of a second. Perhaps the only time I could really think where I might be shooting slightly slower is perhaps if I'm panning with a very fast moving subject where I want the background to be blurred out. So it's not really going to be something that I'm going to encounter too often. However, if I'm going to be dropping the shutter speed down, I know it's going to be happening. So what this does perhaps indicate to us is that at 20 frames per second shooting lossless raw images, the ProGrade Cobalt CFE card was the limiting factor. So this level of performance, whilst it's not at a minimum sustained write speed of 1400 as on the packet, the performance at around mid 800s up to 900 megabits per second does seem to be in line with other review sites who have reviewed that card. Now, interestingly, it's possibly only a few cards, including the Nikon 660GB card, that has the performance to cope with the full capabilities of the Z8. Interestingly, on the Nikon US site, there is now a page with recommended cards on, and the ProGrade Cobalt 165GB card isn't on that list. Now, in addition to understanding the performance of the cards, actually finding that limitation at shooting at slower than 1/250th of a second shutter speed, where the shooting display doesn't update in real time, might also indicate that the camera is operating at the edge of the performance envelope of the Expeed 7 processor. Now, that's not a criticism of the Z8, it's a great camera, and it shows how Nikon has really designed the totality of the Z8 performance envelope to really use the processor, that Expeed 7 processor, to the full. So what have I learnt from this little experiment? Well, I now know I can reach for pretty much any of my CF Express or XQD cards for probably 60 to 80% of my still shooting situations. If I'm going to be working at the edges of the performance envelope, shooting much faster frames per second, then I probably have got to reach for my CF Express card. But equally, there are going to be limitations on that. So I really have to think about which cards I'm using for which situations. Now, interestingly, the SD cards, the Kingston and the Lexar, may be fine for overflow and pretty cost-effective option for many different situations, including video shooting. What I've been finding with the ProGrade Cobalt CF Express card is actually for shooting video. So today I've been shooting H.265 10-bit 8K video. Is the CF Express card comes up with a hot card warning at about 16 minutes, which is slightly disappointing. So I'm going to have to be reaching out to ProGrade to see if perhaps I've got a rogue card, or if this is the performance you get with their smaller cards. So can I recommend the ProGrade card? Seems pretty good for stills, but I'm sitting on the fence when it comes to video recording, and actually I've switched over to my Kingston SD card for recording the final sections of this video. So this has been a slightly longer, more technical video. I hope you found it useful. I hope you found some of the insights useful. Now, as always, it'd be great to hear in the comments below, how have you chosen the cards that you're using for your Z series camera, whether it's a Z8, a Z9 or a Z6 or 7. What were the decision points for you, and how are you finding they're working? As always, it'd be great to see you in a future video.